You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Monster House presents.
Monster Talk's a proud member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, home of such shows as Subtext, The Projection Booth, and the Daily Meditation Podcast. If you'd like to advertise on this show, contact sales at advertisecast.com.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
Hey there, Monster Talkers. Today we got a real treat for you that was a long time in the making. I don't recall when the first listener email suggested I check out the PBS web series Monstrum, or who first asked if we could get host Emily Zarka onto Monster Talk as a guest. But there have been a lot of messages like that, and I finally managed to talk to her last September at DragonCon and introduce myself. I'm excited to say that despite our respectively busy schedules, we managed to get this chat arranged, and I think we'll probably talk again in the future because the interests of her show and ours has so much overlap, and both of our shows express a deep passion for the history and culture of monsters around the world. You can find links to Monstrum in our show notes, or you can just go over to YouTube and search for the word Monstrum, M-O-N-S-T-R-U-M, and be sure to check out other interesting shows from PBS's channel Storied, which produces high-quality content on monsters, language, folklore, and other aspects of the humanities. One little bit of bookkeeping I need to tell you about is that we are going to be changing our advertising partnership and platform soon. We appreciate the opportunity that Airwave has given us, and we wish them success with their continuing efforts to generate revenue in the science communication space. If all goes well, you shouldn't need to make any changes on your end, but do keep an eye on your feed as we roll into August and make sure that you're getting all your Monster Talk content as expected. Remember, if you ever have trouble getting episodes or you're not sure if your feed has the latest, you can always go over to monstertalk.org and find our entire back catalog. I'll continue to post reminders of this until we've made our transition. And thanks again to Airwave for working with us through this change. Now, let's get to the
Monster Talk.
In this episode, we're going to be talking with Dr. Emily Zarka. She is on the faculty of the English department at Arizona State University, teaching undergraduate and graduate classes in composition and literature, and serves as ASU's official monster expert. Listeners will probably know her as the creator, writer, and host of the popular YouTube series Monstrum, which is the flagship show on PBS's Storied Humanities channel. And we're really excited to talk to her. And so welcome.
We're fans.
Yeah, welcome to the show, Dr. Zarka.
Hello, thank you so much. It's great to talk to y'all.
Well, I know from having heard you speak at DragonCon that you're even deeper into this stuff than I think having a YouTube channel would suggest. So I was really excited to hear you sort of go deep on that panel that I heard, and I thought maybe we could get you to open up a little bit about that with us today in our audience. I think our audience is well informed on monsters, a lot deeper than maybe your average person, but before we do all that, could you tell us how you got into the academic side of using monsters in your teaching? Because, wow, I love it when people manage to do that.
Yep. Thank you. I do too. I would say that I use my research with monsters and more the research side than the teaching side, unfortunately. I'm fingers crossed for, a large lecture class on just monsters, but I live and breathe this stuff. I truly do. My interest in monsters and horror in general started when I was a kid, when I was very young, and I always just had this true affinity for the genre. And back then I didn't really understand why. But during my career at University of Colorado, I had some absolutely wonderful professors who sort of solidified what I had kind of known deep down, that horror does have meaning, that monsters serve a larger purpose. And that, sparked an honors thesis that became the, part of the cover letter for my PhD applications, and then to my actual dissertation, which looks at representations of the undead in the British Gothic Romantic period. And doing that specific research on the undead, just the way I treat research in general, I cast a really wide net, and I'd find myself going into these, I call them like research holes or research spirals, where I'm, reading for 2 hours about what mummy flesh might have tasted like. And that's not really relevant, like the chapter that I'm writing, but I'm fascinated by it. And through the work I was doing in grad school, looking at folklore and literature and the science and history and politics and, social factors that really do contribute to our construction of these monstrous narratives, I realized that I felt that sort of knowledge and information shouldn't be just behind the doors of higher academia. And I became really passionate about being a public scholar. So taking my expertise and making it more accessible for as many people as possible, which led me to the base concept for Monstrum, and then to working with PBS. And since then, I've had the absolute joy of doing things like you said, like Dragon Con, and, writing blurbs for anthologies and book. I've been at San Diego Comic Con. I've just had this truly crazy journey of being able to research what I love and talk about what I love, and hopefully make connections with other like-minded individuals like yourselves, that these stories that some people dismiss as not being significant actually have real world importance and significance, even just outside of storytelling.
Fantastic. Emily, you're definitely our kind of person. We're used to going down rabbit holes and doing deep dives into all of these topics. So I think we're kind of jealous, really.
A little bit, yeah.
Of your Monstrum gig. That just seems like a dream job. So could you tell us a little bit about how Monstrum came about?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I started working towards that public scholarship angle and finding ways to take this information and what I'm passionate about, not just inside the classrooms where I was teaching, or in, those tiny little groups of like who's actually going to be at like these academic conferences. So I believe I started first, actually wrote an article about the importance of zombie films and how they've changed in the 21st century for Slate magazine. And then ASU asked me to go to Washington, D.C. They had a new campus opening there, a satellite campus. And I gave sort of a TED-style talk about my idea for Monstrum, saying that I wanted to show these connections between different cultures and different time periods, and frankly, between humans and maybe ways that people didn't expect, using monsters as the device to do so. And I was fortunate enough that someone who was there for that talk said, hey, I have a connection at PBS. I know that they're looking for more humanities content. Can I put you in touch? And bless the good folks at PBS Digital Studios, they gave me a chance as at that point just a PhD student who had a degree in journalism and a degree in English literature already, but not really a YouTube knowledge at all, to be quite frank. And I had 15 minutes to cold pitch the show to them. And I was so naive going into it. I didn't have like a pitch deck or anything. I just, really spoke from the passion that I have. And they gave me a chance. And one episode on YouTube, actually on Facebook, TV, when they used to have that sort of program, became, a green light for the series on Monstrum. And Monstrum aired its own channel in 2019. And we are on our, I believe, 6th season right now, which is absolutely insane to think about. Brilliant. And sometimes I do pinch myself and be like, how do I have this job? This is, the most incredible gig. Yeah. And again, it's not just about learning. I love that I get to learn something new about every single monster that I research. So even the ones that I think I have a good grasp on, I just find these new perspectives and these new, connections in between real world things. And that just keeps me really invigorated with the work. But frankly, it's with people like you that make this job so great too, is I've found YouTube as a whole, at least the folks who, are fans of Monstrum, to just be a really open-minded community who, share their own stories and their own interpretations of these creatures. And for me, the biggest success. There are two things I use to measure success of a Monstrum episode, and it's not views. I mean, of course, you want to have good views, but for me, it's if I feel confident that I have done comprehensive research and that I've pulled from a variety of sources, particularly fact check things that maybe are misconceptions. And then if I have someone comment like, oh, this, helped my child, feel more confident about X, or, oh my gosh, thank you for sharing this story. I remember my aunt or my grandmother or my uncle, sharing this with me when I was a kid. And that to me is one of the most rewarding things is, not just about views, because that's truly not why I do this. I joke that being on camera and hosting is like my least favorite part, which is ironic because now I've hosted for so many other things, but it's really that horror community I've just found just open arms. And I think that that's something super powerful. And I'm just happy to be a small voice that gets to contribute to that.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I want to add too that my 9-year-old son is a fan of the show. He loves to watch it.
Oh, so see, that makes my heart sing. Thank you. I'm
really
so happy
enjoys watching it with me, and he's a little skeptic and asks lots of great questions, and so it's just a really good educational experience for him to watch it. But we wanted to ask a little bit more about the show, how it's put together. Could you tell us how Monstrum is produced and put together?
Absolutely. I have the most incredible production team, Spotson. They're based out of Austin, Texas, and they're actually pretty involved in the PBS Digital Studios network as a whole. Some other, big shows are also produced out of their studio, including Be Smart and 2 Cents, in addition to the stuff on Storied. So it's just a really cool group of people to work with, and they're incredibly talented. And bless them that, especially this many seasons in, and frankly, from the beginning, they've allowed me to have, I think, a level of creative and content control over the show that maybe other production companies wouldn't have. And we're very collaborative. So the first thing that usually happens is embarrassingly, this is the first season we've actually planned every single episode from the very beginning. Because sometimes it's just like, hey, I read this weird thing. Let's do an episode about that. So we actually have a full schedule this season. But I come up with a list of things that I try to balance. So what we try to do is balance the maybe more obscure things that might be digital folklore stuff that, general public isn't familiar with, or it might be focusing on, non-North American monsters and really sort of opening up our audiences to monsters across the globe. And then it's just stuff that I think is cool. And we try to balance doing, those 3 different types and, not trying to focus on, just bird type monsters or just this one type of monster. So we really do each season try to go for breadth and depth, I would say. And we, sort of spitball those ideas with each other. And then I actually I'm a little bit unusual in this regard that I read every single YouTube comment on every single video that's posted on the Storied channel. And I know a lot of other hosts and creators who think that I'm absolutely off the wall for doing that.
What does your therapist say about that?
Don't read the
comments. I've gotten so used to it, to be quite frank. It surprises people that I think actually made me a better educator and digital storyteller, because I've developed more of a thick skin. And, the reason I do read through the comments is to find suggestions and new perspectives. So I keep a running list, a Google document of every single monster that someone writes in that they want to see an episode on. And I actually will tally it. So based on this is the most requested to the least, and, pull from that when I'm looking for ideas for the season. But once we decide sort of the monsters that we want to look at, I go deep dive into research mode. And that can be depending on the sources that are accessible and sort of oftentimes how long the monster has been around. That might be a 1 week or 2 week research, sort of project, or that might be a month or more, just depending on the scope of the monster. And sometimes the project is too big for the time. So for instance, we were going to do something about Thunderbirds this season, but I was like, this is way bigger than I thought that it was, and I'm going to need to pull in a lot more experts. So with my other, time constraints and stuff going on, I'm like, cool, we'll save this for another season. Let's find something, a little more niche that, is more accessible to keep that balance that we're looking for. Once I do the research, I write the script, and then that first version goes to the production team. So that is my executive producer, assistant producer, and director. And they'll give their comments. I'll do either 1 or 2 more revisions, and then we do table read before we actually shoot. So making sure that things are flowing And that's really interesting because there's stuff that we change something in every single table read, sometimes more than others. Then we film the episodes. I've gotten much better at doing that, I will admit. Before it would take me an hour or more for each episode just because I was stumbling through things and whatnot. And now, it's way shorter than that. And then that footage goes to production. And David, my director, will make a collaborative sort of document of, this sentence we want to pull from this archive, or this is the kind of illustration we want from Sam, our amazing illustrator. And I'll go in and make notes like, oh, let's make sure that, we're showing Tiamat as just sort of like a watery shape, not necessarily a dragon. So I definitely do contribute to that as well. And yeah, we do the cut and review the cut, make changes. The cut goes to PBS, they review it, it goes through a fact checker, and then we air the episode. So it's crazy how many episodes I think we can do with sort of the time constraints that we have. But again, this is by no means just like a one-woman project. I really rely a lot on that incredible team and our incredible illustrator, Sam Allen. So he's been with us from the beginning and definitely helps add to the vibe of the show.
Yeah, the illustrations are just fantastic. But thank you for giving us that overview. I wanted to ask a specific question about you going into research mode. Do you ever do any hands-on investigations and research?
Yes, I have had the opportunity to do that a few times. I'm hoping to do more of it. Honestly, the biggest thing that's stopping me from doing it is money and time, because it's a lot more of a lift to, fly somewhere to go through a library archive. But again, I found that librarians and scientists are wonderful people. I recently reached out to the Smithsonian to ask them about something, and they actually, replied and gave me this really detailed. So again, monsters just bring people together, and it gives me so much joy. So I do love the chance to be able to do hands-on research. So for me, that would be going to usually more of like a cryptid or a local legend spot and really diving into the archives and talking to people there who hopefully were involved from the sort of origins of that. So we did that with the Mothman episode way back when, which was super cool. And then we did it for the 3-part zombie episode on YouTube and the Exhumed documentary that aired nationally for PBS. And that was so important, not only to have the chance to film in New Orleans, where a lot of the history of the zombie is, rooted there in a lot of ways, pun intended. But also I wanted to make sure that for such a sensitive topic, because the zombie, ZOMBI, is something that is alive and well, and people in Vodou and voodoo practices do believe in that quote unquote monster. So I wanted to make sure I was pulling from priests and priestesses and other academic experts to try to really give, the full breadth. So for me, hands-on research isn't just archives, it's talking to other experts. And that I would say is, I like to say that for someone who's in the humanities or the social sciences, my lab is the library. So I do a ton of archival research in addition to, reading peer-reviewed text and sometimes Reddit threads or XChan stuff. And, I really try to pull from as many sources as possible. And where I think there's a gap, that's where I bring in an expert. And that's something we started doing a couple seasons ago that I think has been really exciting for the channel to, get different people, everyone from comic book creators and folklorists, scientists and scholars in the humanities, people have just such a wealth of knowledge out there. And, I'm grateful that I have a platform that at this point is recognizable enough that I get to talk to a lot of really cool, really smart people.
This cross-domain perspective on monsters, I think is, we've been doing this show for more than 15 years, and I've come to the conclusion that you can't really understand monsters from a single perspective. Like they mean so many different things, and there's so many different ways of examining them. So I really wish there was more of like a multidisciplinary monster conference, and it's really sort of my dream for our show to somehow be involved in or put on something like that at some point. But have you thought about doing that? Like maybe something that would produce some sort of a volume or something that would make it worthwhile for the academic people to be involved.
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, there is an incredible, actually, academic journal called, ironically, Monstrum, and there's also the folklore journal out there that try to do a little bit of that. And there are a couple sort of smaller niche, I would say, academic conferences, but you're pointing out, I think, again, something that's missing is where the public and, the higher academic or the traditional scholar get to merge, at least in, a really popular way. And I think that that's definitely an idea for all the publishers out there, academic or otherwise, for like a special issue or, I mean, one of my ultimate goals I would love to do would be to make an academic journal or edited collection, talking, of course, about the undead probably, but pulling from scholars from all across the world, whatever sort of, area of expertise they have, talk about their specific monsters from their cultural perspective, I think could be really cool. So I think there's definitely potential for it out there. And y'all know, you've been to Dragon Con. I know some of these other cons out there, there are these sort of pockets where I think people are dying for that kind of thing to happen. So let's speak it into existence. I think it could be really cool, and I think it could be really popular.
We'll put you on the list of people I want to keep in touch with on this, because I really believe in this strongly. I really want this to happen. So yeah. I used to work very closely with an organization called now Zombified Media, which kind of did that thing with this umbrella of zombies. It actually started as like a partnership in like the psychology department and the humanities largely about this, loose definition of the zombie and things that take over our brains. And we've had a couple of academic conferences for that. So, I think it's possible.
Someday. So, Emily, how does your classroom use of monsters vary from the kind of more general audience that's targeted by Monstrum?
Great question. So for me, since I teach undergraduate and graduate courses, a lot of my undergraduate stuff does have to do with first year composition. And while I'm very transparent about myself and monsters might pop up in casual conversation, I would say that monsters in the classroom for me largely are in my literature courses. And those conversations are more about close reading, not necessarily the monster, but the text in which the monster appears, and using that as the entry point to talk about various issues, right? So the obvious ones would be something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Frankenstein, or Dracula. But again, I like to, in all my classes, I like to challenge people's misconceptions and the very idea of like genre and definition. So the question that always comes up in my classroom when we talk about monsters is like, who is the true monster of this story? Mm-hmm. Is it, the creature or the being or the entity that's perceived as being deviant and there's, the scary narrative around that? Or is it more about the people who are pointing the finger at that thing? And those are always really fruitful conversations. So I would say that it's more nuanced when I use monsters in the classroom just because of, course goals and other things like that. But I do think it's an entry point for a lot of students. And whenever I teach composition during the fall, which I will do this coming semester because of October, of course, I do 2-sentence horror stories as like my, Halloween sort of prompt. And we really talk not just about monsters and things that scare us, but, how can you tell an entire story and, engage in ethos, pathos, and logos with only 2 sentences? How can you use punctuation and description and, active verbs to really get people to care about something when it's only 2 sentences long? So that's monster horror more broadly, but I think that's such a great exercise because it shows my students that it is possible to have an incredible, emotional impact in just 2 sentences. And I use that to underline, just look at what's happening, with political advertisements or news or your Instagram or your TikTok feeds. Like if we can do this in 2 sentences, think about, the possibilities if you're looking at a paragraph or an entire movie or, an entire book.
Love it. A lot of fun.
I'm just thinking about slasher movies that have a 3-act structure.
It's funny that you use that reference. I can't say too much, but you're probably going to love this season's Monstrum special for October.
Ooh, consider me teased. Well, how has working with monsters academically changed your perspective on them versus just as a fan when you were growing up?
I think that obviously academically, because I do such comprehensive research, so I'm what some people would call a structuralist. So I don't believe that a text or story exists completely independently. Like for me, it's not just about the words, or it's not just about what the monster looks like. It's, what are the social and cultural political, again, scientific, like what is happening in the world around the creation of that one creature. And I think that applying that perspective to monsters has completely changed for me, and that it's never just like, oh, this thing has fangs. It's like, okay, why does it have fangs in this particular area of the world? What behaviors does it engage in? Who are its target victims? How can you defeat it? Who are the kinds of peoples who are telling stories about those monsters? Where do they first appear in print? Is it in a newspaper, something that really happened, or is it in a fictional story, or somewhere in between? Is it oral tradition? And I think that approaching monsters with more of a critical academic lens, I have way more questions than answers now. But I also think that that is so exciting. And I think, again, just a really interesting way of looking at the world and looking about humanity. And I've looked at so many monsters. I think we're like done research on upwards of 80 monsters now at this point. And it's also really interesting to see what monsters share characteristics, or when things start changing, if that's like a historical time period, if that's connected to a particular religion, or to, a global trend of some kind. I think those things I would never have thought of just as a fan, but it makes watching movies so much more exciting, or in reading comics, because I've heard this from other people, and I'm sure y'all are some of those people as well. I was just talking to a folklorist, Aiden, for my Lala Chusa episode, and we talked for like an hour before we actually filmed, and we were just discussing how, as people who sort of know the historical background of some of these monsters, just seeing those little Easter eggs in, fictional texts makes me so happy. Not only because does it show the care that those creators went to, but I think that that's like, again, that moment of connection or understanding that people can share. And I think that's really powerful. So a good example of that I can think of would be the 2 La Llorona movies. Are y'all familiar with this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the one on Shudder that's like actually from, a like Latina perspective,
yes,
and talking about issues of colonialism and socioeconomic stuff and everything that was going on there. And then there's the whitewashed American version of La Llorona, and I think that that's such a good one. Was more successful than the other, let's say. And I think that part of making good horror content, at least for me, good monster content in this day and age, is allowing traditionally marginalized voices to speak and have a place at the table. And if you yourself don't identify as part of that community of the origin of the monster, then you sure need to be bringing in people who can, add that perspective. And again, I think that's another really cool thing that monsters do, is it gets people talking who might not have had conversations before. At least that's happened with me and a lot of the experts that I've talked to. And I think that's a really valuable lesson as well.
Absolutely.
I think this is funny to me because it kind of started out as a joke, but it isn't really a joke, which is we started observing through several people's research that monsters, like the things that people actually report, are often heavily influenced by the fictional content that they consume. Mm-hmm. And but it's a bidirectional thing, so that a popular movie or a popular pop culture thing can influence what people see as well, which I just, that interplay between fiction, folklore, and the like actual experiences of people is just fascinating to me. We called it, or I coined it, scriptids, where the movie influences the cryptid. But I mean, I see it in things like, speaking of indigenous content, the Wendigo, which is,
yes,
a really complicated monster, and it's really important to have its original context. But on the internet and DeviantArt and all these places, it's become this sort of weird antlered monster that's, that has a sort of a physical identity that seems to be disconnected from its more important or historical cultural milieu, I guess. It's like,
absolutely. I mean, we see that with the Wendigo. We see that with a lot of monsters that appear in Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, we see that.
Oh yeah, Tiamat, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I deal with this a lot. I do back and forth about this because I think there's a way you can change a monster, even if, from its origins. I think you can do it intentionally and unintentionally, and I think sometimes it can be successful and sometimes it's not. And I think the Wendigo is a great example. I've done an episode on that, and I believe that the influence for the Wendigo appearing with those antlers, it comes from the 2001 horror movie that Larry Fessenden did. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and I've not talked to him about this ever. I have, been like in the same periphery as him, but I've never had a chance to ask this. But he did Until Dawn, the horror game, like video game, and spoiler, but whatever, it's an older game. Wendigos play a huge part of that story, and it's dramatically different from how he portrayed them in the 2001 film. So for me, I read that game as sort of his, not necessarily apology, but like, oh, maybe there are some things I should have done differently. Like, I'm going to tell a different story because I have, more information and probably more input. So yeah, I think that it's okay to change certain aspects of monsters and their portrayal, as long as you're at least have a knowledge of why you're doing it, and hopefully with respect of the cultures they come from. But you're absolutely correct that I think, again, a lot of people who don't maybe engage as much with monsters or think as much about horror critically think that these are just, grotesque things or like things meant just to scare us or what have you, when, as you pointed out, there are very real instances where there is that sort of trade where someone does a thing in fiction and that appears in like a cryptid sighting, or that appears in the way a newspaper or a news channel handles the coverage of that sighting, and back and forth. And I dealt with that recently with my project with Audible, looking at serial killers. So it's called Serial Killers Real and Imagined, and the whole sort of underlying question I had with that exploration is, why are we so fascinated by serial killers? And how do our expectations of what a quote unquote serial killer is play out in fiction and also in the real world in terms of news coverage of real serial murderers, but also things like convictions and, how victims are treated. So that was, I'd say that usually don't do like real monsters, not human monsters. So that was a different project. But again, same questions like y'all are pointing out. I think that it's naive to think that popular culture does not have real world applications outside of fiction.
Yeah, we could just talk to you for hours. You know so much, and this is all so interesting. And you've kind of given us a glimpse already into what you're working on. But could you tell us a bit more about what you're working on at the moment, your future projects?
Yes. As I mentioned, we are actually doing something really cool for Monstrum for Halloween/October this year. We're going to be trying some more non-traditional things. That's all I'll kind of say with that. More in line to like what we did with the Universal monsters. So trying to be very thematic to sort of the eras we're talking about. So excited about doing that. I just, came out with the Audible series. I'll be at Dragon Con. And then personally, I'm revising an academic monograph right now about the undead. And I'm also putting some feelers out there for 2 books. One that looks at the undead, and these would be more public facing, and then one that looks actually at cryptids and approaching those from an academic nonfiction standpoint as sort of these, like tabletop books or like cool modern like bestiaries. So hopefully, those will come to fruition, but I'm consulting on some projects as well. And, just honestly, I don't say no to a lot of things, which is for better or worse. So I'm just kind of the ride and, hoping that I get to, keep doing all this cool stuff.
Very
Fantastic.
cool. All right, well, I know we used to do a very long form show, and I feel like we could probably talk for another 90 minutes and not run out of things to say. But we are on a tighter schedule now, and I regret it. But I do want to ask our signature question, since you've been so kind to join us, and I really am deeply interested in what you're going to answer here. What is your favorite monster?
This question, I will say that my answer often changes, and I joke that it's like choosing who my favorite child is, right? Like
Feel the same way.
Said that.
I will say before I give my current answer that all undead beings, all reanimated corpses of any kind will always have a special place in my heart, because that's truly what got me into horror and got me on this incredible journey that I'm on. So they're sort of my top always. I really love the Knuckle of V. I think it's just so gross and dramatic and interesting that's definitely one of my favorites. And then recently...
can you, for our listeners who may not know it, what is that?
Yeah, so the Knuckle of V comes from largely Scottish mythology, and it's essentially a quote-unquote spirit in flesh who lives in the sea, and no one knows exactly what its shape is when it's under the water. But on land, it takes the form of a skinless human torso riding a skinless horse. And again, super gross. But whenever I see something like that seems so oddly specific and so different, I'm like, okay, there's got to be something
There's
here.
got to be a story there, right?
Story.
A new one for us.
Right? Yeah, well, I love Nakalafi. So watch that episode, but no, truly, they're really interesting. So definitely go into traditions of water spirits, but interestingly, they're both truly demonic, and there's some evidence that this was a type of monster that helped explain things like sudden death in horses, or an explanation for when crops would die out because it had like poisonous breath. So I think that's also just a great example of how these seemingly ridiculous monsters have these real world connections to a degree. But I would say probably another one of my favorites is the basilisk.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit of a weird choice, but I learned from that, which I kind of knew before researching that episode, that the original basilisks were more like chickens than the giant thing that we see in Harry Potter.
Right.
So I think that's just super interesting.
We covered the basilisk, and that was the source of maybe the most exciting learning that I've had on the show, which is that no, here we go, which is that roosters don't have penises, and I it just shook my world. Like, why do they call them cocks? I still can't let go.
Right? It's wild. And to think that it actually goes back to like crocodile, it's crazy. See, again, we could talk about this for 90 minutes. You're totally right. But yeah, those surprise moments when you're doing the research, and the basilisk in particular is like so rooted in understandings of science and zoology hundreds of years ago. I mean, amazing. That's the kind of stuff that they should be teaching in school to get kids interested in science.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Definitely.
Well, and it seems like it's one of those monsters that just begs for sort of a euphemism. Like, well, you go into a cave and there's poison gas and it kills you. But, it's just as easy to say it was a basilisk, because they didn't understand, all of the sort of things that can go wrong when you enter closed spaces. But I just,
personally, I find myself doing that. I'm not to bore y'all with the story, but long story short, there was some weird object on our neighbor's roof in like the middle of the night, and it looked very inhuman. And I jokingly turned to my husband and I was like, oh, it's a werewolf. Like, and I know in my head that that's not what it was, but at that moment of shock in time, like that was the first thing that popped into my head is how to explain that. And I'm an educated person in the 21st century. So, I mean, just monster history in general, I'm like, that was an aha moment for me. I'm like, oh, so this is how that happens. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the big changes we've had is, when we started out, we were very focused on, is it real? Is it not real? And branching out into these more interesting and deeper cultural questions of what's the significance? Why does it emerge here and nowhere else? Or how is this like a real thing? Or how is this used explanatorily to explain a really complicated idea? These are... monsters are wonderful, and I don't think we're ever going to get tired of them, and I hope you never do either.
Endless
topics. I never will. Yeah. But I've approached it the exact same way. You summed that up perfectly. For me, it's never about is the monster real or not, or trying to credit or discredit people's experiences. It's, for me, the question is, why do people want to believe this is real?
Exactly.
And I think that's far more interesting.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I know it took a while to pull this together, but it was
great fun.
It was. We really appreciate you being with us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully I'll be back someday.
Yeah, and I'll see you. Hopefully I'll get to see you at DragonCon. So
yes, please. I'm going to be on a ton of panels, so come say hi.
Awesome. So
great. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just listened to an interview with Dr. Emily Zarka, host of the PBS web series Monstrum. Check out our show notes for links to Dr. Zarka's work. Karen and I think you'll really enjoy the content and the visuals. Around the world, people report monsters. But are they real? Join the detective of the impossible, Joe Nickel, as he walks you through investigations to reveal often surprising natural explanations behind some of the most famous cryptids and legendary animals ever reported. Using scientific skepticism, meticulous fieldwork, and historical deep dives, Joe Nickel seeks out hidden clues and real-world candidates that sometimes reveal that even the most unlikely monster stories may have a basis in reality. The Science of Monsters is the first book from Monster House LLC, the publisher of science shows Monster Talk and In Research Of. The revised edition is now on sale and includes corrections and suggestions from you, our listeners, and now readers. Sales of The Science of Monsters directly benefits Monster House and its podcasts, thanks to the generosity of its author. Pick up the revised Science of Monsters today at Amazon.com, available in paperback and Kindle editions. Monster Talk theme music is by Pete Stealing Monkeys. If this had been an actual emergency, you would have been instructed where to tune in your area for news and official information. We'll see you next week when we'll hear a familiar voice say, "That's right, it's the return of Ken Fader."
This has been a Monster House presentation.